Yeah, hi everybody. I'm just here to talk about the work that we were able to do on conservation easement land. So as a land trust, regardless if you're conserving land or restoring land, you have to be able to find a willing landowner to work with. Oftentimes, when you've got a conservation easement in place, you do have a willing landowner in terms of moving forward with restoration. And one thing that we've discovered is having large areas in conservation means you can get some pretty big projects done. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about two different projects that KCT was the project manager for. One is on the Elum River corridor. That's almost 1,300 acres of conservation easement of the entire geomorphic floodplain, both sides of the river. That it's an easement that KCT holds. We did restoration in two phases, and you can see that there. And I'll get in more detail as we move forward. And then also the Hundley restoration. It's a 500-acre conservation easement that included both uplands and almost a whole mile of the Yakima River on both sides. And again, it offered us the opportunity to do some pretty extensive restoration work, as you can see there. Next slide. So here's a map of the conservation easements that are within the Suncadia Master Plan Resort. So KCT was actually formed by a cooperative agreement between the developer at the time, Mountain Star, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Yakima Nation. And so the different colors on this map represent the different types of easements we have. And that blue that's flowing through the middle of the resort itself is the Elum River corridor easement. When the developer had first purchased the land, there was the intention of using a lot of that river riparian area as a beautiful place for hundreds of chalets. And you can see just to the upper left corner is the Elum Reservoir. And so it is a very regulated reach of the Elum River and has a dam that helps attenuate flood flows. So it would be a very attractive place, you could imagine, for those chalets that a developer would like to do. But it was the intention of the Yakima Nation and Department of Fish and Wildlife to preserve that critical habitat for salmon and other species. Next slide. So this is some river or flow modeling of the Elum River project before, after phase one, and after phase two. So the river before restoration, and this is the 220 CFS flow, cubic foot a second. So this is like the winter flow that comes out of the average winter flow that comes out of the dam. But you can see the river is pretty much a glorified irrigation ditch at this flow before any of the restoration work. And so what would happen is when they ramp up the flows to 3,000 or more CFS, those side channels would get activated. But when they would drop that in the late August, drop it down to winter flows, it would disconnect those side channels relatively quickly and stranding a lot of fish. And so our intention on the project was to open up as much of that habitat as possible to maintain flow during those low flows. And so the first phase was 2 log jams, and it created almost 2 miles of additional side channel habitat. And then in phase two, we opened up 5 more side channels that also included an additional 5 miles. So in essence, in this 2-mile reach of the Elum River, we were able to add almost 7 miles of side channel habitat that's available for fish at all flow scenarios. Next slide. So this is just the, we had to go to the landowner, which was the resort, to get permission to do this type of work. Luckily, the easements had protected the property from development. There was not a lot of infrastructure in or around the areas we were doing restoration. So it was relatively easy to get that approval from the landowner. And that's particularly because we've got almost 20 years worth of partnership working between Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Yakima Nation, and the developer. Next slide. Next, we'll talk about the Hundley Conservation Easement. So it includes about 500 acres, and KCT helped negotiate the deal. The holder of the easement, though, is the Department of Fish and Wildlife. This was finalized in 2011. And essentially the landowner wanted to, they were seeing extensive development happening in and around their, or surrounding their property, and they really wanted to protect the property in perpetuity from the intensive development that was happening both upstream and downstream of the Yakima River. Next. So the restoration project included two side channels and a pretty extensive riparian revegetation in what was once old pasture land. And we were able to work with the landowners to develop, what they envisioned a good restoration project was. Next slide. But there was an issue. There were some things on the project that were identified as potential restoration actions by KCT, our engineers, and our partners that were a big red no-go with the landowner. Next. First, the red along the river there is some riprap, and basically it was a broken up bridge that DOT placed along the river at the request of the landowner's mother to protect the river from lateral migration into that portion of their property. And the landowners at the time were pretty adamant that they wanted to leave that in place. So we had to keep that in place. Next slide. And next, the arrow is pointing to what is Nelson Creek. And what we were trying to do as well was seeing if we could find some good connection to the Nelson Creek. And Nelson Creek drew waters every year. And so we were hoping to use that ponded area, a formal gravel pit, to supplement water and flows into Nelson Creek and provide additional off-channel habitat for fish. But again, that was a no-go for the landowner because aesthetically they thought it would drain the pond itself. Next slide. But that said, we were still able to get a pretty large scale restoration project done. Those over a half mile of side channel and a pretty much stale reach of the Yakima River, an extensive amount of riparian revegetation, and we're able to put a lot of wood pieces within those side channels as well to provide additional habitat benefits for fish. The main stem itself was a little bit more difficult to get more work done in because of the extensive recreational use. A lot of people float this reach on the rubber alligators paddling with a 16-ounce tall boy. So we had to be very mindful of the safety considerations of restoration in this reach of the river. Next page. So basically, my main point is when you're working with a landowner that has a conservation easement, you have to determine what those landowner goals and objectives are. You also have to understand what the easement holder, their goals and objectives are, and understand the language of each easement. Now, every easement is kind of like a snowflake. There are a lot of different variations that can happen, although they have the same basic principles that were outlined before. There are little things that are put in each easement as the goals and the objectives of the landowner and easement holder are different for each property. But what we've learned is sometimes you got to compromise with the landowner and really determine what are the costs versus the benefits you're going to receive out of restoration project. And you just got to realize sometimes you can't always get what you want, but you find sometimes you get what you need. But that said, easements are a powerful tool towards conservation and eventual restoration of property. But you just have to understand that easements don't give you free rein on restoration potential. And also the easements require partnership, trust, and really good relationships to maximize the value of those easements and the restoration potential of a project.